from our Durban studios to tell us why he thinks this could well be the beginning of the end.
Good evening, Vuyo.
Good evening, Lukhona. Is it as bad or going to be as bad as you say it's going to be?
Well, Vuyo, I really think it's going to get worse, and there are a number of reasons. If you observe in the last 2 to 4 years, we've had a number of near hits and misses of a recession, whether a technical recession or recession. We've had the manufacturing sector dipping into a recession on its own from previously. This means that our economy has refused to recover since about 2008-2009 financial crisis. And of course, I accept those who say we can no longer blame the global recession for this, because by far and large, economies around the world have actually recovered quite meaningfully. And we have seen emerging economies, and particularly a number of African economies for that matter, going forward in terms of growth and actually attracting massive investments into their shores and becoming the fashionable destinations for investors. You look at the likes of Kenya, Rwanda, and how investors talk about them today. But of course, I am also not one to say growth can only be driven by investors, particularly foreign investors. Locally, what are we doing to cultivate a number of sectors? One, we remain without much of a policy in terms of the informal economy and how people should participate there and how they should be assisted to participate. And yet the informal economy has massive success stories in terms of how people have used it to as a shock absorber between themselves and unemployment and poverty. Vuyo, if you look at the other indicators, continued fuel increases, the weakening of the rand, unemployment statistics, and of course, in a situation like this where there's a recession, there's high possibility of growth of inequality. And this is what we've seen with the last recession that happened, particularly the 2008 and 2009 one, was that the richer continued to get richer in that time of that crisis, and the poor became poorer. So it is a making of a society, one where people, of course, we saw that household expenditure has also decreased. People will no longer be able to afford the things that they could. And of course, the value of your groceries in terms of the basket is starting to decrease as well.
Well, Professor Raymond Parsons of the University of the Northwest asserts almost matter-of-factly in a statement he released this afternoon that he says South Africa has greatly underestimated the economic damage of the past decade and how long it'll take to turn the economy around.
Well, Vuyo, I do not want to call it the past decade, because it and in one end oversimplifies the structural nature of the problems of the South African economy. I am not sure whether if you absented the corruption and the sort of malfeasance that took root under the leadership of President Jacob Zuma, if you absented that, you would still be with a better economy. There is something that is quite structurally embedded in the South African economy. If you remember, even during the years of growth around President Thabo Mbeki's time, we still discussed that it didn't create much of of employment creation and unemployment decrease. So we've had a structural unemployment problem in the economy, and the research over the last 24 years has actually shown that unemployment is one of the key drivers of poverty in our society. So there is a conversation that we do need. What the last 10 years did for me was to accelerate a problem that is inherent in the governing party. One, a problem of too much distance between alternative thinkers in terms of economic policy shifts and new paradigms that we probably need to experiment with and adopt, but also just a simply disregard for good governance and of course prioritization of what other people think about actions of government. So the erosion of governance did play a massive role in terms of weakening the outlook on the South African economy. But even now, in this new era of a new leadership, Vuyo, what we are not seeing is a bet of confidence among investors on the new era, because literally not much has changed, because the people who are now presiding over South Africa are responsible for the erosion that happened in the last 10 to 24 years. And so as a result of that, if you look, for example, in terms of capital outflow, we're still experiencing much of that as a country, and we have not arrested it. So as much as you may look for new investments into the economy, it doesn't help that you are not de-accelerating the rate at which you are experiencing capital outflows in the market. So yes, there is a bit of the last 10 years, and we're definitely going to feel it, but there's also the issue of structural economic problems in South Africa.
Well, the minister that the governing party you referred to has put in charge of the country's finances, speaking after news was out there that we are now in a recession, said there's no need to panic, that government, in fact, has a plan up its sleeve.
Vuyo, when a South African minister says, don't panic, there is no crisis, that's exactly when you should be jumping for your life jacket, because you are really about to be met with crisis. Denialism has been the order of the day among the governing party leaders, particularly because if they do not deny, then they will appear weak and having failed the country, and they will have no political capital to bargain on for re-election in the next elections. So they can't admit failure, but it is our duty to point out that there is massive failure, there is massive crises. You will remember, Vuyo, in the last 4 years, there have been a lot of round tables between business, labor, and government trying to come up with economic recovery plans. In actual fact, the current minister, just the week of his firing back then in December, the infamous December 2015, if I'm not mistaken, he was working with other government ministers on an economic recovery plan. It never took flight. They have been promising. In the last month, President Cyril Ramaphosa came onto our screens at night saying that they are working on an economic stimulus package, but they are not talking with additional funds coming from elsewhere, what you may call deficit spending in the economy. They are looking at reordering the current budgets, which are already problematic budgets, because in February, the Minister of Finance then, Malusi Gigaba, actually made sure that he cuts back spending on some of the government departments. And if you look at the data that came out today, of course, government spending as well has suffered in terms of a decrease, and it is going to continue to suffer if you look, for example, at the proposals to cut the public service personnel and all of these things. So when a minister says there's no crisis, I'm very much aware that we are in the midst of crisis.
Well, that's how we're going to leave it for now. Lukhona Mnguni, thank you very much for your time coming to us live from our Durban studio.